Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Marisa Hicks Alcaraz. My pronouns are she, they, ella, nosotros, and I am a CGU Cultural Studies PhD student focusing on grassroots digital archiving, and I am super excited to be the moderator for today's panel on digital and public humanities. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that CGU sits on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Tongva people, and we extend our respect and gratitude to the original caretakers of this land. Today's panel marks the end of the spring's series of talks celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Cultural Studies Department at CGU, which has been dedicated to reflecting on the past, present, and future of cultural studies. The final event will be a conversation with Kevin Young, the director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, on the topic of the future of the museum, which will be held on October 7th. And you can also see the recordings of the previous talks on the Bradshaw website. I'd like to thank the Cultural Studies faculty, Dr. Eva Wishi, Dr. David Luis Brown, Dr. Joshua Good, and Dr. Nadine Chan for organizing these series of talks, as well as my fellow graduate students who worked on tech support, communication, and logistics for this series, Lee Painter Kim, Laura Black, and Kate Rutz Robbins. I'd also like to thank our audience for being with us today. We moved the date of the talk from May 3rd to support the nationwide Day of Refusal led by the Cops Off Campus Coalition, which our panelists felt very strongly about supporting. And you can learn more about how you can support these efforts and Abolition May by visiting the link in the chat, so copsoffcampuscoalition.com. And we're continuing our support of Abolition May by focusing today's panel around topics such as colonialism, surveillance, neoliberalism in the university, and property logics. And before we turn to the panelists, I'd like to go over a couple of logistics. If you have any questions for the panelists, please write them in the Q&A. And if you have any comments or would like to share any resources, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We encourage collective knowledge production and are hoping to have an interactive and animated discussion. Okay, so rather than reading the bios of each of the panelists, they're going to introduce themselves. And once everyone's introduced themselves, each of the panelists will give a 10 to 12 minute presentation on their work in digital and public humanities. And so we're going to begin with Dr. Jack Giesking.
Hi, I'm Jack Giesking, Assistant Professor of Geography at the University of Kentucky, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. I'm not going to be talking about my new book that just came out. Funny enough, I'm going to be talking about, sorry, Michelle, but I promise to reference it, I promise. Talking about my new project on Transtumblr, but I just had a book come out called A Queer New York, Geographies of Lesbians, Dykes, and Queers about New York from 1983 to 2008 with NYU Press. So thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be in conversation with all of you.
Thanks so much, Jack. And now Dr. Mishana Goman.
Sikan, everybody. Hello, my name is Mishana Goman. I'm Tonawanda Band of Seneca from what you may now know as New York or Western area, New York outside of Buffalo. I am a professor in gender studies and American Indian studies at UCLA, affiliated faculty in the botanical gardens and community engagement, as well as in critical race studies in the law school. I also am special advisor to the chancellor on Native American and Indigenous affairs. I get all the Indigenous, American Indian, Native American in there. So I'm very happy to be here today. And I speak to you today from UCLA or Tovangar, which is Los Angeles.
Thank you. And now Justin Williams.
Hi there, everyone. My name's Justin Williams. I use he, him pronouns. I am an archivist and project manager for the Southside Home Movie Project based at the University of Chicago. It's my joy to be here with you all today. I'm going to present on what use is a home movie archive, and hopefully we can get at a lot of the questions that are undergirding a lot of our fields and our projects through that.
Okay, thank you so much. So we're gonna go ahead and start presentations with Justin, and then we'll go to Dr. Goman, and then we'll end with Dr. Gieske.
Okay, perfect. I hope everyone can see my screen and that it's hopefully of a good proportion. Just let me know if not. I want to extend a very large thank you to CGU. Everyone here has been amazing and extremely helpful. Especially want to give a very heartfelt thank you to Eve and Marissa for inviting us to join this conversation on the cultural studies for the future, and also to be joined among such amazing panelists as well. To our film donors, our supporters and friends of the project, thank you so much for trusting in us and supporting us in living out the mission. The topic that I'll be presenting on is what use is a home movie archive? So as I mentioned, I'm Justin, and I'm one member of the larger Southside Home Movie Project team. We're led in this work by Professor Jacqueline Stewart, who is our director as well as the Chief Artistic and Programming Officer for the Academy Film Museum. And our team is also comprised of Sabrina Craig, who leads our programs and our development work, as well as Avery LaFlamme, who has been a longstanding crucial member of the Southside Home Movie Project as an intern during his time as a undergraduate and now graduate student. So I wanted to get to this question about use and preservation, and really at the heart of that is a question about for what purpose, preserve for what. Though rarely put that directly when interacting with members of the community or the university, there is at the heart of it this question of, I think in the entire field of memory preservation in general, why are we preserving it? What is its value? And more importantly, how can I use it? And I just want to touch on something that I feel is at the heart of that charged question. And it's something deeper, something that deals with a larger memory problem. As many I imagine watched in January, the National Poet Laureate Amanda Gorman really spoke to this through her poem, The Hill We Climb. If only we dare, it's because being American is more than the pride we inherit. It's the past we step into it and how we repair it. Memory is at the core of how we build our identities. From it, we make meaning and tell stories about ourselves, our families, and our communities. When memory is lacking, our narratives are also lacking as well. Stories are told without substance, complexity, voice, or choices. Then how can we step into it? How can we repair? If we do not repair, we will not fully remember. At the Southside Home Movie Project, we have long been fascinated by the power of memory. We began our work in 2005 as a new archival model for encouraging local residents to recognize the value of their home movies and to build a publicly accessible archive for creative projects and scholarly research. We launched our digital archive in 2017 to create online access to our entire collection. And in 2019, we were honored with the Association of Moving Image Archivists with the Ray Edmondson Advocacy Award in recognition for our community efforts. Yet 2020 happened and we were all struck with the same reckoning. And that was, how can we still be of use? Of what use are we in these turbulent times? And so the Southside Home Movie Project, like many others, found ourselves physically distanced from our communities and our work. And we pivoted quickly to the new realities and stumbled upon some new models, which we couldn't have foreseen. The majority of my talk, I'm going to just try to illustrate some select examples of our work in 2020 and how our home movie archive spliced together from reels of the past to offering connections, acknowledgement, and healing to our present. So when COVID pushed us remote, we could still access our film collections thanks to our publicly accessible digital archive. I imagine we're going to talk about the platforms quite a bit later, and I'm happy to take any questions about it. Through this online portal, artists, researchers, and students could still reach us and explore our home movie collections. I want to highlight 2 film projects in particular that reached out to us to incorporate our archival films, and we're lucky enough to also speak to some of the zeitgeist of 2020. We worked with the producers of Rick Burns' Driving While Black, and throughout the year, and by its premiere in October 2020, this in-depth exploration of African Americans on the road had become an even more meaningful acknowledgement of the very real danger and precarity Black motorists continue to face, while also inviting us to experience the freedom of mobility that vehicles make possible, particularly in these moments of lockdown. And so here's some of the footage that was selected by this 2020 PBS documentary to kind of illustrate this further. Hi, David. Yes, these films were shot without audio. I should have given that disclaimer. So at the time, most of our films in our collection are silent films. Another project that reached out to us late last fall was Sylvia's Love, which premiered at Sundance a little over a year ago. And it was a touching film about a Black couple that falls in love. They build a life during the age of jazz, early television in the 1950s. They requested, they wanted to revisit a world long gone and wanted to use home movies to encourage folks to visit again. Selections from our archive can be seen in the promotions on Instagram. And so I'll just give you all a sample of what that was. Building upon these film projects and the various ways in which they were using it, the Southside Home Movie Project from the beginning had known the importance of bringing the images back into the community. And so it's been an important part of our mission to engage communities through the familiar experience of watching home movies together, with family members narrating, music playing, and generations sharing stories. Beyond mere nostalgia, the quote above from our director, Jacqueline Stewart, explains our intention and how we seek to accomplish the act of archiving in public for the public. We want to bring home movies back home. We wanted to bring home movies back home and recreating the warmth and intimacy of watching them live again with friends and family, which led us to create Spinning Home Movies. So in April 2020, we launched this new series of free public live stream programs that invited Chicago's top DJs, musicians, and spoken word artists to dive into our film archive, to find home movie moments that resonated with them, and to marry them with sounds in unique and surprising ways. What began as a way to foster connection has since emerged as a new paradigm for meaningful artistic collaboration, bringing contemporary artists, archival material, and expanded viewership together on a globally accessible platform. To date, 14 artists have explored the archive and created a series of soundtracks, each with a unique mix of original song, recorded songs, and audio. The artists and the film donors joined us online for the premiere of each episode as well. Word spread about the program throughout the spring and summer and winter, and was wonderfully received with positive media attention. To date, the program has garnered more than 1,000 views per episode, with hundreds of viewers, including the home movie donors, family members, and friends and newcomers coming to join a lively conversation in the comments. In 2020, like the name pretends, we all learned to look at the world more clearly. Some of what we saw was reflected through Spinning Home Movies. This quote from Jamila Woods, the brilliant Chicago poet and musician with whom we collaborated this summer, eloquently captures the spirit of our thinking in those early months of quarantine. To remember and to be remembered, these are powerful antidotes to the period of isolation we've been experiencing and a call to reconnect with each other. And so I'll just play just a snippet from one of these episodes. And sorry, I realize I'm going a little over, so I'll try to speed it up. And with the death of George Floyd and the calls for justice turning to chants and marches and shouts, when troops took to our nation's streets this summer to repress uprisings in ways not seen since 50 years ago, we also called upon artists we called in artists to help us remember that this was not the first lynching of its kind, just the first fully captured on video. And when they turned to our archive looking to explain this depth of pain, which has seemingly been erased, and moments of rebellion, they offered a language which we did not have, and just further used the films in ways that illuminated these truths. And so I'll just quickly jump to play that episode by Leslie Honoré, who gives her unflinching poetry to honor the lives of Black and brown boys and girls over these intimate scenes in collaboration with music producer Rob McKay.
George called out to his mama, who was 2 years gone, called out with last breath, last plea, last hope, called out to be saved, protected, needed, called out in fear, called for his first safety, his first home, his first love. He called out to all of us, the mothers of brown boys with smiles wide as heaven, mothers whose sons tower above them, and the mothers whose arms long to hold boys that never grew into men. He called out to us, "Mama, mama, mama." He called to God, "Mama." He called to the earth, "Mama." Final cry, then no more. And the mothers answered with rage, with pain, with sorrow, with hundreds of years of murder of their sons and daughters. The mothers answered, "Burn it all down, 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 down."
And so, just to conclude, despite the isolation and uncertainty of 2020 and its effects carrying into this year, we believe home movies have offered meaningful ways to reach across the distance and connect our families, neighbors, and communities. Watching these films remind us of how closely our lives resemble those of others and how intimately bound together we are. By recalling our memories, facing our pain, we may repair the harm, apply the balm, and inspire deeper healing and connection moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was really powerful. Okay, and next we'll turn to Dr. Mashana Goman.
Yeah, Justin, for that. I'm going to share my screen here. I think it's working. Can you all see it? Yeah, okay. Great. I'm just going to go over a few aspects of our project, Mapping Indigenous LA, and I'll probably mention a couple of my other projects that I'm working with Wendy Teeter on as well, who's co-PI of Mapping Indigenous LA, as is Maylee Blackwell, and Juliana Nasi, who's joined our team. She's a professor in gender studies, and she's working currently on the Pacific Islander map. So as we go, I just wanted to, since this is a talk on the futures and methodologies of digital humanities, it is my hope that in this future of digital humanities, that Indigenous people are collaborated with in proper ways and in meaningful ways as well, that help reframe some of the knowledges that have been situated in the academy over time and have been situated to kind of promote Indigenous people, erase our presence in many ways, but also only pull us out when they want to talk about a historical beginning, but don't have a continued futurity. So I'd like to just kind of preface what I like about digital humanities is the ability to constantly write and rewrite because, and constantly as a way to deal with messiness. And what I like about the digital humanities is that ability to deal with messiness because colonialism is messy business. It leaves messy debris all across the US and all across Canada, indeed all across the Americas. It just leaves messy debris that doesn't have any clear definitive narrative nor authoritative narratives, even as it tries to maintain a kind of white supremacist hegemony over the land. So this particular project, Mapping Indigenous LA, was done with that kind of eye towards thinking about colonial messiness, the messiness of how there's been different kind of containers of production knowledge that have separated Indigenous peoples either through a construct of what it means to be American Indian, for instance, in federal Indian law, or what it means to be Latin American Indigenous diaspora. And while we use some of this kind of work, we wanted to create communications amongst each other to try to bring back those kind of Indigenous protocols of talking beyond what has been these constructed containers for us, right? And these constructed containers are often mapped, like literally mapped through colonial constructions and colonial cartographies. So how can retelling or rethinking our stories begin to create a conversation that breaks out of those containers, but also recognizing the colonial messiness because we have to, because that's the kind of present that we live in. Those are the structures that we live in that are constantly with an eye towards violence towards us in many ways. So part of this project that I worked on with my co-PIs was as faculty, we were having these conversations. It's kind of the privilege of being in these institutions, educational institutions, where your job, well, I look at it as my job, not everybody does, although that's also part of the problem of the academy. Our jobs, I think, are to learn from each other just as much, and from our students just as much as we are here to teach, right? I look at it as a landscape of which I always love to learn across disciplinary boundaries and across various containers or lot containers that we're supposed to have, right? Like Indigenous studies can only be over here. And what I often see, and this is also part of the problem with people's methodologies at times working with Native communities, is that there's a kind of scaredness that they're going to approach something wrong because, you know, technically Americans know the least about Indigenous histories of this land and where we're at. Even like some of our basic leaders, which I don't really agree with the whole, you know, leader mentality with organized grouping and organized social movements, but at the same time, we don't even get that. So I think there's a particular way in working through this project that we wanted to also have stories, or to tell the stories of just people that are doing the everyday work of cultural education across Los Angeles, and people that have maintained certain cultural practices despite a colonial development across the Los Angeles basin. So behind me, you'll see Tovangar. This is a map done, and this is on Winston Street, which, or also known as Indian Alley, which is in downtown LA, or Yonge. And this particular young artist is a street muralist. He's really amazing. He's Gabrielino Tamva. And he did this particular map that resituates how we think of LA with Indigenous place names. It's like one of those maps, if you don't know, if you can't read it necessarily, that it kind of mimics that kind of Western cartography. But yet in the place names themselves, if you have that deeper knowledge, if you have the story that goes along with those place names, that gets into more of a thick mapping than a thin point mapping that one can grasp somewhat. Behind me, Yonge is downtown LA. Caravagna is where University High School is, which is about 1.5 miles away from UCLA campus. And I'm just going to show you here real quick. Here's a map that we had River also do for us, a commission piece to situate UCLA within Tovangar, which is the basin area. So when you look at this the Gabrielino Tamva, see their area, if you stand on the beach in Santa Monica, as the San Gabriel Mountains. And those kind of become a way of conceiving of that particular territory. And coming to Mapping Indigenous LA, again, the faculty and I were having these conversations, like, I wonder how, it comes out of a specific story that I don't have a lot of time to get into now, but it comes out of a specific story that took place on Pimu, which is Catalina Island. And I was out there, and it was amazing to me how, because of the invisibility of the Gabrielino Tamva in LA, that they were not consulted in the practice of returning buffalo relatives or bison relatives over back to Rosebud via helicopter and by an intricate process because of the overwhelming presence of the buffalo on Pimu Island due to the fact they're not hunted or eaten or anything. And they're brought out there for Westerns in the 1950s. It's itself a ideological mapping process of Westerns that took place and creation of frontier myth making and all of this. So it's kind of interesting that Pimu became that place where these relatives grew, these more than human relatives overpopulated and became part of that lore of that island as well. So that people come to Catalina specifically to see these people, these bison that are actually not part of the natural area. And meanwhile, during this whole process, there was also the removal of Gabrielino Tamva presence on the island as well. So there, to me, it became this kind of thinking about the multi-layering of space on the island, how American Indian came to stand in as this kind of pan-Indian identity, but yet what that allows across the United States is a replacement of the actual first peoples or the actual caretakers. So in conversation with other people, we talked about how LA is one of the largest diasporic Indigenous cities in the entire nation as well. Yet Native people across the board in Latin American diaspora, the indigenous people are often erased during that large, broad racial category as well. I would also say at one point we wanted to do a Garifuna map, and we're also thinking about that as well, recognizing those indigenous relatives also. Pacific Islander, it becomes one of the, Los Angeles is one of the largest places where Pacific Islanders reside outside of their home communities, so that we have a huge area within the Carson City area and LA County where you also find populations of Pacific Islanders. So we also noted that all across LA, there were specific people who operated and made place in Los Angeles. Although it's Gabrielino Tamva land, they also made peace and kept their traditions through this kind of placemaking across Los Angeles. So we wanted to at once create a conversation amongst people, and we also at once wanted to talk about that placemaking. What does it mean to be a diasporic Indigenous person and make place in the city, right? And in this particular place. So we started off with with categories that we're going to discuss. Gabrielino Tamva and the Tataviam, who are the first peoples here. Tataviam are up over on the other side of the mountains, but you can take a look at their website, for instance, to really get a good sense of where their territory is, because it's not as simplistic as I'm saying here. There are a lot of shared spaces as well between the Tataviam, the Chumash, the Ahachiman, and those surrounding areas. Ahachiman are down in Orange County areas, Chumash are up north, Tataviam over here, and the Tamva rate situated in that Santa Monica, downtown LA area. When you start getting towards Long Beach, you're starting on the edges of the Ahachiman territories as well. So there is a specific way within these story maps that we started to talk to community first about the kind of maps they wanted to create. And this is actually, I think, key in working with Indigenous peoples, is that you ask, what are the questions that you have? And a lot of our questions and a lot of our map making were formulated through these conversations that we had with them. Instead of having an imposed map form, even though we used Esri and we were limited somewhat through that platform, Esri platform, and deciding what kind of ways that we put this in. We had a low budget, I'll be honest. So that led us to the kind of stock templates, but there were different templates that could have different meanings for each of the groups. So at first we had thought, well, maybe we should keep this unified and go about it that way. But then in quickly talking to communities, we realized that each community had different needs, and we had to recognize those different needs before we even began collecting the stories, the archival material, and all of that kind of work to think about how we were going to begin this process of telling a story of making place in Los Angeles. So we started with these 4, we also noted early on that we needed an Indigenous crossroads and currents, because there were places that weren't easily I'm sorry, I forgot my water, that were not easily just American Indian or easily Latin American Indigenous diasporic places, but rather there are places like in the sports arena, in rugby, where I found in my experience, I was coaching my daughter's rugby team. I used to play rugby, and it's a big Pacific Islander sport, but then somehow I had all these American Indian girls also on the rugby team. So that's one place where it could be a cross current. Basketball, American Indian basketball teams and youth groups, that's a huge thing, but it is also the same in Latin American Indigenous diaspora areas. So the sports arena, around food, around powwows, dance, and in any of these kind of activities, we saw a lot of cross currents. This was particularly true because we said crossroads and currents. The currents came about because we held this one, which you can find on here as well, where the Tomva, Gabrielino Tomva, Cindy Alvitre, who's head of the Tiat Society, which is the Canoe Society, had said something like, well, really, we're a part of Eastern Oceania, in that we have more in common with our Pacific Islanders, brothers and sisters, than we do with, say, Navajo, even though that's the same categorized group, technically under the American Indian racialized category where the Tomva are plays. In essence, like if we're thinking about place-based peoples and what makes place, they share the ocean, right? The ocean is what connects them. So how do we conceive, and how can even these place-based geographies and identity upset those kind of containers of knowledge production about each other, right? And so we have a blog on here called Eastern Oceania, and we brought all the canoe societies together to talk to each other. And it was pretty an amazing event in that, as with everything, you get food. We had food, and we talked first about what the event would look like and brought everybody together. But it was an amazing event because you had Samoan and Chamorro canoe makers, as well as we brought the head of the Chumash Tiat Society and Tomva Society together. And what we found was that many of the people who were practicing their canoe practices, the Pacific Islander people, actually hadn't had a chance to actually talk and meet with the canoe societies that exist here from the First Peoples here. So it's kind of bringing into balance that conversation. We actually probably need to have a follow-up event around that. So again, what we realized in doing this, that needs to each community were specific, as I had said. The Tataviam, for instance, we're going through a federal recognition process, which is incredibly difficult and long and costly. So that was run through several tribal councils and elder councils in order to make sure that we were doing no damage. And so giving community those first rights, and whatever community we're working with, is still kind of is still what we attempt to do through Mapping Indigenous LA. It's taken a little longer, for instance, for the Pacific Islanders, because you have different islands coming together for that map, and island nations with their own different cultural language, all of that together as well. So, you know, some of these things we decided eventually that we have to work on communities' timelines and what they needed, but I'm very excited for that to be done. It should be launched by this fall. I'm given a couple extra months, I heard this summer, but I'm hoping it should be launched by this fall. Whereas when we worked with the Gabrielino Tomva, there's several different lineages all around LA. So we have one map so far, we have others forthcoming. And that is a selection of perspectives on Gabrielino Tomva places. So what we found here too is that some of these places have multiple stories, and it's not that one story is right and one story is incorrect, as we often see in the mapping practices, colonial mapping practices, but rather all these multiple stories have multiple meanings and significance, and they all should be held at in that significance for what they mean. So this is just one perspective that we did here. So with that, we also realized that with all these multiple stories that we were telling about placemaking, Indigenous placemaking in Los Angeles, is that teachers are still calling and asking how to use it, right? Or us to come into their classrooms, et cetera. That's just impossible. If you think about Los Angeles and how large Los Angeles is and how many elementary schools there were, I used to know the number at one point, I can't think of it now, but there's only 1,000, there's about estimated 2,000 Gabrielino Tomva people. Even if they were all educators, that's not enough to go into every elementary school or to change the minds of LAUSD in a really fraught education system when it comes to educating about Indigenous issues and Indigenous peoples. So we quickly also realized, and a lot of our maps are responses to what community wants and needs are. So we have an American Indian education map and an American Indian health map to try to help people literally find the resources around Los Angeles that they could use if they're to arrive in the city, for instance, and not know where to start, which is pretty relevant. The teaching resources, we also wanted parents to be able to say, hey, you know, instead of teaching about Columbus Day this way, why don't you come and look at these resources? And so we have teaching resources that are primary resources and secondary resources from their Tomva approved resources. And so that is very helpful for the teachers. We did a workshop at the AAA, which is an archival, just really great archival source. And when we went and did a workshop, it was for fourth grade, third grade teachers. They brought their resource material and wanted us on the spot to say, is this good to teach from? Is this not? And we couldn't manage that. So part of this teaching resource area is coming from that perspective. What is needed to teach people in a good way? So this is, we also got funding to hold a third grade teaching workshop, a Tomva cultural teaching workshop. And I'm getting teary-eyed when I talk about this because two of the elders that participated have now passed. But in this Tomva cultural education workshop, we came up with these Tomva lessons, particularly Craig Torres, the cultural educator leader. He's the one that helped develop these, but we also worked with actual educators. Trust me, nobody wants me teaching their third grader. Not even my kids never wanted me to teach them. So with the third grade, we started there because fourth is where a lot of people want to reform curriculum for Indigenous people. But by that point, you're only wrestling with loss. You're not wrestling with what was lost and what does it mean to have a relationship to land and place, right? So what we found from the cultural educator workshops is they wanted to start in the third grade where the mandates are for third grade education. We followed along what was mandated by the state and federal level, that land and environment was needed, but starting with Indigenous philosophies there and not just the development of state history, which then gets into the violence, was an important part of where people should start, is understanding those different formations of what land means, right? Land not just as property. which comes about in 3rd grade. So these teaching resources, I highly suggest if you want to take a look. I actually think this could be done in each and every state, in each and every large city, where people could very much start to develop these. We have it on California. There's a California, or particularly a Tamva area, but yet we also have teaching resources at the larger level, like when you get through into high school. We had grad students collect and do some of our researchers collect and look at nation approved teaching resources. So what does the Cherokee recommend to teach on the Trail of Tears, right? These kind of approved resources so that teachers can weed through that, right? Because they have a hard enough job. So I'm not going to go into the definition of that, but I wanted to talk about forms of mapping and their difference. Like a lot of times people think of mapping Indigenous LA as this counter mapping. But I don't think of it really as counter mapping. I think of it more as a remapping, that is a repoliticization of the spaces in the historical presence. What does that mean? And I want to start there because I think the dealing with the present and not just a counter map, which might tell a different mapping of the past, that doesn't get us in where do we need to go in the future. So I'm all about politicizing space in the present in order to see where we can go in the future and think about land differently and think about the environment differently. And also thinking about maybe, hashtag land back. What does that mean? And I'll get into that in a second. Indigenous mapping, I also see as that which thinks about Indigenous as an ongoing practice into the future. Indigenous mapping, I recently had somebody say, I'm on a lot of committees, and so I hope this isn't a little bit anonymous. It's anonymous. But he was like, I was talking about using traditional ecological knowledges in order to think through climate change and sustainability and ecology. And he's like, well, we can't think about the past. We have to think about how to deal with climate change in the future. And I was like, who knows more what climate change means than somebody who's seen their land developed and lost again and again and again, week after week in LA. And I say week after week because I just went down the road and there's a whole building blown up and, they're putting up condos everywhere. So week after week, there's a particular way that the Tamva have watched the land shift over time. I talked to elders who knew a time when from Westwood all the way to Santa Monica, it was farmland, right? It's very different now. So this is in one person's lifetime. So I think there's a particular way people understand and want to place Indigenous people in the past, but I really want to make clear Indigenous mapping is not about mapping our past places, but mapping our futurity into place now. And Laura Harjo kind of gets at that with thinking about emergence geographies. I haven't really, I'm working on that. The book just came out. So I really love her concept of emergence geographies, which are about using community and collaborative tools to empower and reclaim spaces, but also, again, to assure the futurity of Native people. I often get asked also, oh, is that a decolonial mapping? I was like, when all the land back is given, maybe it could be considered a decolonial mapping. But again, hashtag land back. We need to think about how to use I look at the anti-colonial mapping or using the tools that Esri provides as an anti-colonial mapping. But again, it's not a decolonial mapping. I can't provide, for instance, knowing that Bayona Wetlands is Tamva Place and a great important ecological site and basket weaving site. It's not decolonized space because it still belongs to the state. So that might be a little rigid, but it's just kind of my rigidity with it. And I was just on a panel called Mapping Justice. And one of the things I think when people are talking about these decolonial cartographies and things that they have to think of is, what does justice mean and for whom? And what does it look like? And how will it be materialized on the ground? I think too many people use the buzzword of anti-colonial or decolonial mapping, and without thinking also, what would justice look like for Native people? I've been in several meetings recently where if somebody uses hashtag land back, the uncomfortableness in the room, like, what does that mean? We have to return all private property, right? There just is this natural pushback against it. When in reality, people don't realize that a lot of the unceded land remains in our park systems and in various systems that actually could be turned over in Native Land Conservancy terms or in other conservancy terms, which would be healthy and sustainable, not just for Indigenous people. It's not a special class of people, but it could be healthy and sustainable for everybody, for our water and ecological resources, our deep well aquifers, etc. Too many people think about land still as property and as desegregated contained spots. So I just wanted to go into that as a little more of my future work and what I'm thinking of doing outside of mapping Indigenous LA, because I think that that's going to be the future, to try to get people to think what connected land and connected waterways mean. Otherwise, we'll never defeat evil corporations like Nestle that drains all the water in California currently. This is all part of thinking about wherever you are. Think of wherever you are as just, if you go out and find out what native land you're on, who you should be acknowledging in place in that land, think of it as a land introduction. And after that introduction, what are those kind of political relationships that you want to be in with the people of the land where you're at? At UCLA right now, I'm working as special advisor to develop gathering, caretaking, and harvesting um, uh, harvesting rights for the Gabrielino Tamva on campus at UCLA, which can then be used to help all of us kind of form better relationships with tribal peoples and with water in the land that we're on as well, which is of utmost importance, and beginning to think of the mapping process not just as an anti-colonial, but also as something that's working towards a future which we can all sustain together. So just to summarize the best practices here, I always ask students to think through, what is that intent of the project? Does it benefit Indigenous communities in tangible ways? Read the secondary literature, do the background work before you contact a community and start a project. I can't tell you how many people want to have an hour phone call with me and haven't even read one chapter of a 20-page book. I can't do 20 hours worth of telling you basic 101, and I'm not a Gabrielino Tamva whisperer. Like, do the research first, and then you can start to think, then you can reach out to your secondary sources. One of the most important things also in thinking through projects and methods in the future is, do not assume what Indigenous communities want, ask them, and do it from the start, not after you have a full-blown project and a grant proposal or whatever, and then say, hey, do you want to, I need a tribal elder on this. Do you want to join me? No. From the start, don't assume. Go and talk to that community members. Indians aren't that scary, most of us anyway. I might be some days, but you just got to go and ask and not make those assumptions. This has happened numerous times over the year where I have had numerous people come to me and ask, even seasoned scholars ask, I want to map the massacre sites in Los Angeles. And I'll be like, it's not my place to say, but I don't think that's what the community wants. This is not something, mapping Native people only in death, which seems to be, I don't know, in vogue. I don't know what to say. It's always been in vogue, I suppose. Even before we're dead, they want to map us. But that's not what a lot of Native people want. They want to see an Indigenous futurity and Indigenous relationalities, and those kind of, something that moves us towards creating healthier environments with people. So that is not to make an assumption about as well. And also, an individual is not tribal consultation. I've seen a lot of projects that might have talk to one Native person. There's so many different perspectives in any different communities that you're at, that it's good to talk to a vast array of people. And it's often very complex. Again, I will say it, colonialism is messy, and as should our research practices have to figure out how to deal with that mess, right? And dealing with the mess of colonialism is often what makes people fearful of actually going to Indigenous people first before they begin a project. So also remember, and this is my favorite, this is my little added, aesthetics matter. right? There's been times where people even, not you all, but when people think that they'll do a flyer, they'll have me come talk about mapping Indigenous LA or something else. And they'll put like bones on the bottom and then a highway and then a map, right? Like, and they think they're addressing the layeredness of the space, but Native people don't want to see themselves as bones. They want to see themselves as living, live communities. And so I think even in the aesthetics, sometimes we still have these settler visual mentalities. And this is part of the project I'm working on now of how to represent Native people, but that as just in the past or as dead or always in the process of dying, which is really a problematic way of conceiving of Native peoples. And I think digital projects really need to pay more heed to that also. So these are kind of just the ideas that I've been thinking of. And I'll just end here. And I'm sorry I was talking fast, and I'm sorry that I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have. But here's one of my favorite quotes from Gerald Visner, who's an Anishinaabe literary scholar and one of our kind of giant literary leaders. He's a literary scholar, but he also wrote the White Earth Constitution, which is so that he could have that futurity of Native people. He says, "We are the shadows, silent stones, never that simulation of light in the distance. Trickster stones and post-Indian stories are my shadows, the natural traces of liberation and survivance in the ruins of representation." So I'll stop there. Thank you. Oh, there's my stop share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gilman. That was fascinating. I really appreciate the distinctions that you made between like anti-colonial versus decolonial or decolonizing versus mapping futurity and remapping versus countermapping. I also really like this idea of DH as a messy way to approach a messy subject. I think if you want to do a DH project, you just have to accept that messiness is a part of that process. All right, thank you. Okay, and so now our final panelist is Dr. Jack Giesking.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your presentations. Your projects are amazing. I'm really honored to be talking with you. And I am actually coming to you as an uninvited guest from the Nipmuc lands, but I work on the unceded lands and territories of the Osage, Cherokee, and Shawnee people. So I want to thank them. And I want to share some slides. I changed my background for Mashana. I hope it's okay. It's actually reversed the map, which is even more fun. I'm even going to show you the super gay map today. We're going to talk about some trans stuff, super fun. So my work is on, I'm just going to make this small for a second. Let's see, there we go. So I've been working, I would say it's a new old project. I've been looking at data visualizations or thinking about them about when it comes to transgender young people's use of Tumblrs, specifically in the 2010s. And I wanted to talk about, from a DH perspective, about the limits of visualization as recognition. If you've read the book Trapdoor, which is about trans life, visibility as a trap. And feel free to tweet this, and of course you don't have to. I found, I just want to show kind of like what my questions were, like I'm thinking about, should all data be analyzed? And what are the ethics of data analysis of the marginalized? And these are things I've been thinking about for a while and that have guided me. And again, visibility is a trap. So how can actually data visualization make room for recognition? I should say I'm a geographer. My PhD is actually in psychology, but I am very devoted to changing geography. And I really approach it as a humanistic social science. I found a home in DH thanks to Tara McPherson, Lisa Nakamura. I went to American Studies. I encourage people who are interested in DH to go to American Studies and to just come to DH Caucus. There are lightning round presentations for just a couple minutes, and you will make friends for the rest of ever, and people share so many insights and work. So I've been working on trans Tumblr since 2014. Back in the day, people used the hashtags M to F, male to female, or F to M, female to male. People would now say trans masc or trans femme. But these hashtags are still in use even now. And when I was looking for my name in 2010 on the internet in the middle of the night in Berlin, I found trans Tumblr, and I was like, what is this? what are these kids today doing? Oh my gosh, I was already 30 some. And the first thing I found out I was really struck by how many suicide notes there were. There were every 50 to 100 posts had one, and just swarms of young people would then come in and comment on one another's posts. And I'm here for you, I support you. People just listing their phone numbers. And I should say the Tumblr, if you've never seen it, in the top left, is a very like photo blog based kind of site, and usually has text below it. And so this is a great site for trans youth to share images of themselves and to find mutual recognition with one another. They're also finding and sharing medical knowledge. And I included a picture of Leila Alcorn, who, if you've never heard of her, she's actually the person who probably had the most hand in stopping conversion therapy in the United States. It was her suicide note on Tumblr that she had set to go off after she had killed herself. That was a letter to President Obama asking him to end conversion therapy. He's the first president to speak out against it. But there's a massive wealth of information where people share surgery scars, or this doctor's great and this one's not. They're also actually producing culture, defining who is trans enough, because they're teenagers and they argue about that. They're creating social networks, and there's a lot of, I'll get to the visual recognition software there. But in terms of methods, I'm someone who works across data visualizations. Even though I am a geographer, I'm really interested in social network analysis. So the likes that you have create a connection between things, and reblogs. I've had people who have reached out to me about visual recognition software. Do I want to comment on the male-female package, which is code that actually that runs on pretty much every platform that you have at any time, telling if somebody's male or female. And to decide who's male or female, they've actually grabbed images of trans people, often youth, off the internet without their acceptance. And then the coders will decide who is male or female enough to shape the software. There's also the idea of who is indoor and outdoor. Most of the photos are usually taken inside in a bathroom, with people or with others, alone. What do they have in the images, things like that. There's also text analysis, because people are adding data to this, especially the text versus the descriptions versus the hashtags they're using. How does that change over time? There's also mapping. And if you're creeped out by me, the idea of mapping these people, that's good. Me too. We'll talk about that. Don't go to the bad place, I promise, to talk about it. So in terms of research methods, there's just a massive amount of data that I've been gathering. I worked with a young person. It's actually over 7 years of data. And so that's the one thing I forgot to update. I actually worked with an undergrad who I gave research credit to, who created this code in a semester. So I have 1.5 million posts. It's not that much. It's not that big. I've actually written a paper about how data size doesn't matter. And my favorite title paper, Size Matters to Lesbians Too. You want to read about, what we do in DH and how data works differently. But the data sort of looks like this. I've blocked out the names of the users, but you get the hashtags that they used, how many people liked it, the link to the original post, the time and date, the date, time, and then the text that they put underneath, and a link to any image or video. So this is just a year, this is 2015. These are some visualizations I made to kind of give you an idea of what's possible to look at, and the benefits and negatives of those things, and also limitations. So this is the text in a post, so how people talk about themselves. And there's a lot of sense of embodiment. There's a really big affective thing. There's a temporality, how long someone usually, this is F to M, but it also works on M to F, how long someone's been on testosterone or HRT, or how many months out of a surgery or to a surgery. And then the text and hashtags, I love that the hashtag me stands out, and actually me is one of the top hashtags that's been used in both groups consistently over 7 years. So beyond identity terms that we keep seeing, there's a lot of connection to sexuality, to sensuality, and figuring out these things over time. I've also done some social network analysis. So each of the dots that you see are actual people with accounts, and we'll zoom in a little bit. And then the lines, you can't really see the lines connecting them, but that's anytime somebody connected to someone else, liked someone else's work, or reblogged them. So this is, and the reason you can't see, because it's so small, there's 17,000 users and nearly 30,000 likes. And then a year later, 13,000 users, 24,000 likes, and people are about 4.8 or 5 about an average of 5 degrees of separation from one another. So it's smaller than the world's 6 degrees of separation. This kind of community and connection that they're sharing is really powerful. Here's a definitely ethical issue. The first time I presented this, I was at the Microsoft Social Media Collective, and I had the names on here, and Mary Gray was astounded. Why would, it was a group of 6 people, why would you show these young people's names? And these blogs these Tumblr accounts are definitely public, but you have to think that maybe when you're 14 and you made a website, and you think it went away and you don't realize it's still there. And you also don't realize it's in someone's research. So I blocked out all of the names. Again, the bigger the dot here, the more this person's liked things or liked someone else. When I first created this data visualization, all the lines are people connecting, talking to one another, and the colors usually represent like-minded groups. And here's the description. These are liking people back and forth. When I showed this with the names on it to trans youth in college, they knew who all of these people were. And I think if you know a trans person who's under the age of 45, they have been in this world, for even a brief amount of time. And so it has affected how they see themselves, and they know it as a place. And Trans Tumblr is just called that, Trans Tumblr. It's kind of a world. I've also taken that social network analysis, not just likes and reblogs, but the kind of text people are talking, what are they talking about? So something that struck out to me is this is really a space of transition, definitely talking about surgeries and getting recommendations and getting support and talking after, or hormones. So this is top surgery, mentions of top surgery are in orange on the right. And mentions of binder. So this is for FMs. Again, I just used that data set to show you binding one's breasts and pushing them down. The binding is the action, the binder is the object. So what's really interesting is no one's asking for advice or talking to you about how to bind. It's kind of simple. It's just, people are doing it with an ACE bandage. There are other kinds of binders. It's not great for breathing. It's great for one's mental well-being. But this is when these hashtags were used at the same time. There's very few times in the middle where the orange and the purple and the green, the dots actually talk to one another, that the binder people are talking before they have surgery and the top surgery people are talking afterwards. And these are kind of distinct conversations. I did this with my colleague, Crystal Hall. She's the nice white lady up the top. Cis white lady, she's really supportive, awesome, best friend of mine too. And something else we did is we actually did a text analysis on the whole history of TSQ, Trans Studies Quarterly, and we found that any kind of word about a pre-transition kind of object, like a binder or binder, a packer or packing, or inserts, anything to add boobs, anything that was before surgery is really left out of Trans Studies Quarterly. It's been around for 8 years. I think binders and bindings and packers were used 3 times in 8 years. So it's helping us think about different temporalities of trans life and who's being studied and when, what those stories say. So there's a lot of ethics, and I'm definitely going to get to that geolocation thing. So one is the sense of privacy in public. George Chauncey, who wrote Gay New York, famously said privacy could only be had in public for gay men. That's because gay men weren't, allowed to, 2 men weren't allowed to go in a workhouse together. So they're hooking up all over the place, right? It's how we get cruising. But when we think about these youth, they're having a sense of privacy in public, right? These are really undefined, ill-defined terms that give them a sense of safety. And in many ways they do have it. But what limits should I have about using this data? They're unaware, of course, of how their data is being used or by whom. They don't know that they're in visual recognition software. They're being marketed to. If you missed it, there's a whole suite of trans health apps rolling out. Oh, you can't get your hormones from your regular doctor. We can sell them to you and ship them. It's just a massive venture capital pouring into trans people is another niche market. The youth are, they're youth. They do things that they did in high school that they might not want remembered and emblematized as what trans people are. So there's a lot, and also, how do I know that they're youth? Mostly I see pictures of young people. Mostly I see pictures of people who appear to be white. Race is not discussed very much. Trans youth of color who talk to me about this, or now trans adults of color who talk to me about this, would say that they saw certain images of certain bodies and didn't share their images as much. And so how these spaces are formed in terms of race and class is really is happening, and yet you have to interview someone, right? Just counting on this data alone is myopic and inane to me. So it's really about complexifying, like constantly complexifying and incrementally creating this project. They're also reproducing this knowledge on a daily basis, so it's incredible to be able to see it change. And it's also shockingly a little bit overwhelming how static it's been and reifying itself now that we have all the data. And they do pass on knowledge to one another, but sometimes that gets lost as like a big name who's disseminating a lot of knowledge. One of the big dots decides to move off. And again, an absence of, and also geography. We don't know where they are. We don't, sometimes there's talk about disability, sometimes about race, sometimes about class, and then not at all. So much more. So lessons learned. A community accountability is really important. So one idea is I can write to all the top 100 people whose names might appear on that social network in the bottom left. And I can get them to say they would like their name shown because that's important to them. But most people don't check their Tumblr accounts anymore. In case you didn't know, Tumblr's not as cool as it used to be. So all the, yeah, I can see Marisa laughing, that's fair, right? And I think a lesson for me is, you make incremental like productivity, and you have to accept incremental joy. Like you're not going to figure this out tomorrow, and you have very limited tools to do that with. And you're also learning from one another. A point I want to push home, and this is something that I'm working on in a much bigger way as a long-term project, is to think about data vision conversation. So when I learned something from the social networks, just who likes who, what is that? What did the text analysis then tell me? And then I don't need to do the text analysis as in a social network, I could also map something. So how does each data visualization help me read something else when I might not be able to ever find these people again or connect to them? I think it's something about what carries you and what you can learn from and share with others. I picked this project, I'll be honest, I was in the middle of my postdoc and I had a computer science mentor, and he said, well, you're never going to get a job here if you keep writing a book based on your dissertation. He thought that was ludicrous. And I was like, no, buddy, that's what we're supposed to do. And he didn't believe me. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to jump into this project. It has literally taken me 7 years to be able to cope with this data. This it's been incredibly like an emotional life journey for me as I deal more with my transness. And reading really heartbreaking stories all the time is incredibly painful. So how do I do that at what distance to keep me safe and sane, but also really honoring and hearing the voices of these people who left these stories behind, and to what ends? There's a real import of collaboration. My goal, by the way, is to get a multi-year NSF and to what I'd like to do for NEH is much smaller, but to actually get focus groups from trans youth and also trans adults in different places to reply to the data visualizations I make and say, are these the questions you want answered? Are these fair to represent? And just let them rip into these things, right? To collaboratively produce these ideas. There's a lot of trans youth in LGBT centers who have already volunteered to have their friends hang out and do this and even learn how to make data viz. I use almost all open source software, but I hang out with a lot of nerds who've taught me how to use all this free open source software. And so, especially if you want to get into mapping, as Mashana mentioned, like ArcGIS and Story Maps are what's there. If you're not attached to a university, that's, there are limits to how much you can put into a story map. If you want to learn something like QGIS, which is free and open source, that's a whole another bucket of wax. Gephi for social networks, the math behind social network analysis, no one talks about it. No one reports it in the humanities. The number of papers I've seen with just a social network image in it and no one explaining actually what it means is breaking my heart. I need to write a paper about it. But what that math is really hard to explain. So should we be using it or not, and to what end? And right, yeah. Financially, what can you afford? Software can you afford to use after you leave grad school? If you might not be attached to a university, and just knowing you might not find the answers you're seeking. Who owns this data? This is technically a public data set. Anyone could go onto Tumblr and have been collecting this data all this time. But I keep it safe for, when NSF first said that if you apply, you have to share your data with them. That was really horrifying. And to get back to the geolocation aspect, Tumblr posts don't include latitude and longitude, but these are teenagers. And so they definitely, I would say almost certainly, left on their geolocation function. So if you have like an iPhone or an Android, it'll tell you where you took all of your pictures. And so it's really easy. Even I can do it because I don't really code. I got to even tell you, like, I collaborate with other people. And I'm happy to talk about that when we chat. But I can even write the code in Python that pulls all the latitude and longitude out of all of these images. So not only could you map people in this incredibly creepy, if not evil way, you'd be mapping trans teens to their parents' bathroom for the most part, right? Because that's where they're taking these first pictures they're putting online. And so, but there also is a wealth and a very important wealth of knowledge in knowing if the people who are posting here, the young people, trans people who are posting, tend to be in more rural environments, tend to be farther, maybe they're in, it doesn't matter if they're rural, suburban, or urban, but they tend to be farther from an LGBT center. They tend to be farther from trans doctors. And so looking for those patterns can be incredibly helpful when we think about health geographies of trans youth. And so there are ways to always to really sit with the data that you have and think about what can you ethically do to make a difference, to work with other people who are in a competitively oppressed spot to make change, but also not to harm them. Finally, what counts for emerging scholars? This is something I think that, like I study social media, I teach about social media, and I'm usually writing so much about lesbian and queer New York City that I don't get to write about it or talk about it very much. But I think it's hard that these projects, Marisa and I and Eve and I got to chat ahead of time, and you generously said, like, I'm doing a whole nother dissertation on the side. I've lost track of the dozens and dozens of people who have told me that over the last decade. And it's so much work and the kind of recognition that goes into this and the recognition that needs to go into the mistakes. Like, I think we need to write about that more and to amplify that more and to appreciate that. So many people love the maps I created for my book, but there's no census layers to them. There's, they look really good, and incrementally it was great to release them, but there's always so much work to be done so that the public can use them in a way that makes them really useful. And how would I share this data with trans youth? How can I cover up names, or should I reveal names, and in which way? So these are things I've been thinking about for 7 years, and I thought I'd share with you. So it gets back to this question: should all data be analyzed? Which ones do you take out? What are the ethics of doing this? And then, if visibility is a trap, how are we actually making room for recognition? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Giesking. You made so many amazing points, so thank you so much. Something that I noticed across all 3 projects or presentations is how you can really see how DH and public projects can be so personal and grounded in identity, which means that there's going to be a lot of affect, emotion tied into these types of projects, which means that oftentimes, these kinds of projects, are ones that are near and dear to our hearts. And I think do involve a lot of extra emotional labor on top of technical labor as well as intellectual labor. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes. So I think I'll just go ahead and ask one question since it was just building off of Jack's last comment. And that is, what insights can you share with graduate students interested or currently creating digital projects, especially when it comes to platform choice, methods, display, or presentation, and how to have your project and technical labor recognized as legitimate scholarship? With Dr. Giesking just mentioned, writing more about it is one way that we can do that.
I would also add complaining about it.
Absolutely.
I
Right.
wouldn't mind listening to all the things that went wrong for both of you. Like, because that's a lot of work. Like a film archive, like storage, like cybersecurity, like trolling with the map, like your map, Shauna, like how do you protect the map, like what version stories, how do you maintain it, like yeah. I would,
Yeah, when I brought up to the data people at UCLA that I hadn't been tracking the multiple changes I make on the website and in the mapping, I just, there's no going back. So I haven't done that, like data accountability, but that's just one of the things between updating the website consistently, because I've been basically in charge of doing the website updates. Um, Between doing that and everything else that I have to do, I haven't had as good of a practice. And believe it or not, I think at UCLA, they don't have that in place for digital humanities projects. I think people are just starting to think about, I highly suggest, I've been a UB distinguished visiting faculty fellow over this year, and I've been actually part of the UB Digital Humanities Network. They have a whole thread in line on there now about how to document your digital projects for tenure and how to get that, because we're always being judged in this particular way. If you're in the academy, you have to do it. And sometimes it's at odds with, and not sometimes, a lot of the times it's at odds with the kind of person I want to be in relation with the communities I work with, right? And so there's what academia wants to see you as a legitimate scholar, and then there's what the community wants. And so a lot of times I just kind of prioritize. It's made it so that I've had to do two things. I publish constantly in my field of Native literature, which doesn't require the same attention and detail in the same way that I am doing the. I look at the digital projects as my praxis and my public engagement work, which honestly doesn't hold as much as, publishing with the Cambridge 21st Century Poetry book or my monographs or any of these sorts of elements, even though one has a far bigger impact. Like Mapping Indigenous LA has had many more views probably than those who read my book, right? And my book had a scholarly impact amongst a smaller group of people, but it's not changing the way third grade teachers are working themselves out, working out how they teach about Native people, right? Because if you look on our website and you look at those sources, it's very much about Indigenous voices in the present and in the future, not just this past and, oh, isn't it sad they're dead? Like that's kind of what was taught in the past. And so I really feel like if you go to UB, they have some great kind of workshops on there about how to document and how to do these things. David Shorter, who's also at UCLA, he runs a endangered WikiLeaks endangered WikiLeaks program, but he also is now the director of the Archive of Healing, looking at plants. He actually has some great resources and some great articles that he wrote about documenting how to document this in order for you to be on the job market, or to be evaluated, basically. I can't say I did it right, because I didn't, and I still I just can't keep up with the different kind of data accountability you're supposed to have without that specific help within the universities to do that kind of work. So I have to rely on what I care about, which is, does the community like these projects or not, right? Are they useful to the community that we're working with? And that's kind of how I evaluate it myself. But yeah, sometimes it's like doing two jobs.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think a lot of reasons why my job exists is just because of how large of a job it is to maintain, archive, and not just to create a repository where objects are kept, though there is a physical aspect to that as well as a digital one, but to continue to do the work of why are we doing this in the first place, right? The community engagement, the co-creation of work with our community partners, with our artists, with our film donors. And so I would be very curious to hear how Professor Stewart answers that question, since, maintaining it for over 16 years has definitely had to be a labor of love. I'm fairly new to it, only the last 9 months. And I can tell you, yes, without even in my role, I still need a large amount of support from Humanities Computing to help with the maintenance and hosting of it. And if we came along at a great time to build a digital archive, because that is something that they would not necessarily embark upon in this day and age, as more projects are being created in DH, and the just the capacity is a lot smaller and under-resourced. And the digital preservation, yes, we are not situated in the library, and nor do we hope to be, partly because of some of the ways in which access is limited in terms of, can I even get into the building if I wanted to, if I was a resident and donated my films, or, what are the license agreements that one may have to sign, or a deed of gift they may have to sign. And so we've had to kind of create an infrastructure while at the university, outside of some of the normal institutions that may support it naturally, which just generally requires a lot of just a lot of sweat equity from us as personnel, but also and I would say exchange and relationship with our film donors and our film communities, to say that it actually lends us opportunity to build with it together. So though some of the ways in which the archive is built kind of rely upon some past hierarchies of provenance and authority, the way in which we build upon that is very much based in principles of exchange and mutuality.
Thank you. And we will close with one final question from Dr. Luce Brown, which is, to build on one of Marisa's points, to what extent do you all analyze or otherwise foreground political affect in your projects?
I would say a lot from the films that were shown, as well as the different forms of programming and exhibitions. We're very much interested in the changing history of Chicago South Side, but we are very much interested in the narratives that have been, the dominant narratives that have been told, and counteracting those, and reimagining the South Side. So Spinning Home Movies is just one example of how we do that.
So when I'm thinking about affect in the question that was asked in the Q&A, I also think about effective regimes. And I think about this through Purnima Mankikar's work, who looked at this in terms of IT in India. But I also then had a graduate student who also looked at this in terms of how Pacific Islanders and climate change are viewed. Angela Robinson, she wrote a beautiful piece on monsters and effective regimes, but it's basically about how grief can be used to politically motivate people, right? So I think in the affective element of when I'm working with Indigenous peoples, there's this settler kind of settler common sense notion that Native people aren't there. So, but the minute you start to disrupt that, there's also a settler guilt that comes accompanied with that, right? Which then sometimes is not viewed as the anti-indigeneity it often is, and the anti-indigenous futurities it often is. So I think I'm answering the question in the Q&A, but So I actually try to turn that on its head. Like, what are the stakes that Indigenous people have that are also kind of the stakes that we all should hold? Like, how do we form a relationality with the more than human, the water? How is understanding that, for instance, in Los Angeles, our water, a lot of it, not everywhere across, where we're currently doing a project mapping where the different water comes from different parts of LA, because it doesn't all come from Paiute land, but a large majority, particularly for industrialization within Los Angeles, comes from the Colorado River and the draining from Paiute lands north, right? But I guess for me, the analyzing and the effective part is, why do we still operate around, well, why do we still operate our politics around these kind of enforced colonial boundaries, such as LA County or any of these kinds of things, when really in our everyday lives and who our bodies, at the scale of the bodies are, we're actually much more connected to places outside of those kind of colonial imposed boundaries, right? But there's a sort of way I think this informs our solidarity practices, and also thinking on a larger scale basis moving out, right? So I believe in local organizing, that's not to say, but I also think that has to consider not the spaces of colonial spaces of containment that one would have us believe, right? I think there's an Indigenous practice of understanding the relationality between water and land that would help us in these current moments, in these moments of solidarity practices, and these moments where we should be kind of conjoining against kind of larger issues. Like, recently in that High Country News today, they just did that. Oh, maybe it was in LA Times, did the aspect about the DDT off the coast, all along the coast, right? Indigenous people have been talking about that for a while, how corporations were using the California coastline for dropping of contaminated items. And this is common in reservation areas where we actually do have aquifers and such. And so in some ways, it's what Tracy Boyles calls wastelanding, but it's also, areas that aren't seen pretty as that for the toxic waste dumps, but even those that are, now we're finding were toxic waste dumps. So how do we begin to outthink out of those containers? And part of that is, I think, also not thinking through those effective regimes, which would just have people grieve for Native people as something only in the past, right? Like, I think it's breaking out of that settler common sense and coming to an understanding, really, that in the end, our projects are around seed sovereignty, our projects are around protecting water, our projects are around protecting land, which is not just a kind of one race kind of project, right? It's actually thinking about the larger scale of humanity. And when I talk about humanity, I'm talking about Black, Brown, Indigenous, all peoples, and the more than human is part of that as well. So I don't know. That's how I see the effective can often work to also lock us into these containers.
Yeah, I mean, the affect of reading a lot of suicide posts and loss is it weighs on you, and accumulates, and it doesn't go away. And I think trying to hold up other emotions that aren't death. Most presidents will mention Trans Day of Remembrance because that's the day to remember that we're dead, but not to actually celebrate trans life. So finding an archive that is like earnest and honest and young and in a struggle, in their own individual struggles, and then finding one another is also really beautiful. So like trying to hold on to that, like what to guide that out, and to think about what they have left behind and their stories, and what can inform different futures for different trans futures. And as Riley Thornton writes about transness being bound to blackness and how genders, and Sarah Hunt and Kim Tallbear have written about the history of gender, Indigenous, Native, First Nations people. Like these breaking free of these categories too is so important. And how do these like really endearing, mostly young people who want to look like James Dean sometimes, or maybe a Timberlake or a Bieber, or C. Riley Thornton. C. Riley Thornton is a heartthrob in trans online. So yeah, who can they be and what can they be is trying to hold on to that is really important too. But to hold them all together and to make people also be accountable to them. This is what is, they're with the 80 bills in 37 states to try and kill trans youth. So, and make sure they can exist.
Okay, thank you so much for each of your presentations. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to anybody who participated in this series. This was an amazing talk. And we hope to see you in October for the last event of this series. And take good care and have a great week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Take good care. Bye.